An old woman found a Hell's Angel chained to a tree. Her next move left everyone stunned. Sunlight filtered through the leafy canopy above, painting dancing patterns on the forest floor like scattered gold coins. Dorothy Caldwell savored the gentle crunch of leaves beneath her sturdy walking shoes as she continued her steady walk along the familiar path. Her wicker basket swung at her side, half filled with sprigs of fresh mint and rosemary, their fragrance mixing with the earthy smell of damp soil and pine needles. This peacefulness, she murmured softly to herself, adjusting her wide-brimmed gardening hat. It is a blessing. Widowed for 5 years now, Dorothy, whom everyone in the small Tennessee town of Cedar Hollow called Dot, had grown accustomed to the tranquility of her days. She found solace in the predictability of her mornings. Coffee at 6, garden by 7, a walk through these woods by 9, rain or shine. Nature's symphony wrapped around her like an old comforting quilt. Each bird's song and rustling branch, a reminder of the decades she had spent here with her husband Earl. He had loved these woods more than any place on earth. Said the trees had a way of listening that people never learned. Dot paused at her favorite spot, a clearing where wild mint grew thick along the creek bank. She bent carefully, her 75-year-old knees protesting the movement, and clipped several stems with the small garden shears she always carried. The mint was especially fragrant this time of year, late spring in the Cumberland foothills, when everything seemed to breathe with new life. She straightened up, pressing one hand against the small of her back, and gazed through the trees toward the ridge. The morning light slanted through the branches at a steep angle, turning the forest into a cathedral of green and gold. For a moment, she simply stood and breathed it in. 5 years of mornings like this, and the beauty still caught her off guard sometimes. A sudden sharp cry sliced through the stillness, freezing Dot mid-step. Her heart stuttered, confused by the unexpected sound. It was not a bird, not a deer, something human, something wounded. She scanned the dense thicket beyond the creek, searching for its source. The cry came again, more of a groan this time, strung with agony and threaded with desperation. The sound carried through the trees like a warning, and every sensible instinct in her body told her to turn around. Walk home. Call the sheriff. Let someone younger and stronger handle whatever was making that terrible noise. But Dorothy Caldwell had spent 4 decades as a school teacher, and in all that time she had learned one immovable truth about herself. She could not walk away from someone in pain. Not a struggling student, not a lost dog, not a stranger bleeding in the woods. She steeled herself and followed the noise into the underbrush. Thorns caught at her cotton blouse as she pushed through a wall of brambles. Her basket snagged on a branch, and she nearly lost her footing on the uneven ground. But she pressed forward, guided by the groans that grew louder with each step. As she pushed past the last tangle of brush, a disturbing sight stopped her cold. There, slumped against the trunk of an ancient sycamore, was a man. He was massive, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with arms like fence posts and hands the size of dinner plates. Tattoos covered every visible inch of skin from his wrist to his neck. Dark ink swirling in patterns of skulls, flames, and words she could not quite read from this distance. His clothes were torn and filthy. A black leather vest hung open over a ripped shirt, and on the back of that vest, even through the dirt and blood, Dot could make out the unmistakable insignia. A winged skull with a helmet. Hell's Angels. His thick beard was matted and clotted with dirt and dried blood. A large, gnarly chain, the kind you might use to tow a truck, was wrapped around his torso, and the tree trunk binding him to the sycamore like an animal staked to a post. Blood had crusted on his temple, where a deep gash ran from his hairline to just above his left ear. His skin was a patchwork of green and purple bruises, some fresh enough to still be swelling. "Oh, my Lord," Dot breathed, her heart pounding like a frantic bird trapped in her chest. The man's head lifted slightly at the sound of her voice, revealing eyes glazed with pain and confusion. They were pale blue, those eyes, and for just a fraction of a second, beneath all the dirt and blood and rage, she saw something she recognized. Something she had seen before in another pair of eyes a very long time ago. Fear prickled up her spine like ice water. He was dangerous, a biker, a stranger bound to a violent life. Every headline she had ever read about motorcycle gangs flashed through her mind. Drug running, weapons, assault, murder. This was a man from a world she had only glimpsed through television screens and newspaper pages, a world that had no business intersecting with her quiet life among the mint and rosemary. And yet Yet glancing at his wounds, the swollen eye, the split lip, the way his chest rose and fell in shallow labored breaths, everything within her rebelled against walking away. He was hurt. He was bound. Whatever he had done in his life right now, he was a human being in agony, chained to a tree in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help him. Help, the man croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The single word floated on the morning breeze like a fragile, desperate promise. Dot hesitated, fighting the urge to flee. Her hands gripped the basket handle tightly, knuckles white with indecision. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Every rational thought screamed at her to leave. But then she remembered. She remembered the lessons of kindness she had imparted to her students over 4 decades. She remembered the sermons Earl loved so dearly, the ones about the Good Samaritan and the least of these. She remembered her brother Wesley coming home from Korea with that same haunted look, that same desperate need for someone, anyone to see past the damage and recognize the human being underneath. Those well-trodden paths of empathy and faith carried her forward. She stepped closer, kneeling beside him on the forest floor. Her knees pressed into the damp earth, and she could smell him now, sweat and blood and something sour underneath the smell of a body pushed beyond its limits. "I am not sure how much use I will be," she said, grounding her voice with a calm resolve she did not entirely feel. "But let us try to get those chains off." Up close, the man's injuries looked even worse. Bruises bloomed across his face like dark flowers, purple shading to yellow at the edges, where older wounds were trying to heal beneath newer ones. Dried blood had crusted around the nasty gash near his hairline, and she could see now that it was deep enough to need stitches. His leather vest, torn and filthy, displayed the Hell's Angels patch in vivid detail. Intricate tattoos snaked up his muscled arms, disappearing beneath what remained of his shirt sleeves. Dragons and barbed wire and names she could not read. Young man Dot kept her voice gentle but firm, the same tone she had used with thousands of frightened children over the years. "Can you hear me?" The only response was a low groan. His head lolled to one side, exposing more bruising along his neck, and what looked like finger marks as though someone had tried to choke him. "First things first," Dot said to herself, setting her basket aside and examining the heavy chain wrapped around both the man and the tree. The chain was thick and rusted, and she could see immediately that it was not secured with a padlock, as she had first assumed. Instead, someone had tied it off with a complicated series of knots. Heavy-duty knots that looked like they had been designed to hold against tremendous force. Dot's fingers traced the chain's path around the trunk, and as she studied the knotwork, a memory rose unbidden from deep in her past. Earl standing on the deck of their little sailboat at Norris Lake, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease as he tied off the mainsail. "Pay attention now, Dot," he would say with that patient smile of his. "You never know when a good knot will save your life, or when knowing how to untie one will save someone else's." "Thank heavens you insisted I learn these," she murmured, her fingers finding the first knot. "Who would have thought those sailing lessons would come in handy in the middle of these woods?" Her arthritic fingers protested immediately. The joints swelled and ached with every movement, and the chain was cold and rough against her skin. But Dot persevered, working at the knot with the same stubborn patience she had applied to everything in her life. Teaching a struggling reader, coaxing tomatoes from stubborn soil, surviving the slow devastation of watching Earl waste away in that hospital bed. Gradually, she felt the first knot begin to give. The work was slow and painful, punctuated by the man's occasional groans and the distant calls of forest birds going about their day, as if nothing extraordinary were happening 20 feet below them. Almost there, she encouraged, though she was not sure if he could hear her. "Just hold on, nearly got it." The second knot was harder than the first, and the third harder still. Whoever had done this had known what they were doing. These were not amateur tangles, but deliberate bindings designed to hold a man twice her size against his will. The thought made her stomach turn. The final knot gave way with a reluctant loosening, and the chain slackened, falling away from the tree trunk with a heavy metallic clank that echoed through the quiet forest. Dot sat back on her heels, breathing hard from the exertion, her fingers raw and reddened. She reached for her basket and retrieved the small first aid kit she always carried on her walks. Earl had insisted on that too. A practical man, her husband, always prepared for scraped knees and bee stings and the small emergencies of country life. Now she said, dampening a clean handkerchief with water from her bottle, Let us see what we can do about those cuts. She leaned forward and began dabbing carefully at the wound on his forehead. The dried blood softened under the damp cloth, and she could see the cut more clearly now. It was jagged, the kind of wound made by a ring or a heavy boot, not a clean slice, but a tearing impact. The man's eyes snapped open without warning. They were wooled and unfocused, the pale blue irises ringed with red, and before Dot could react, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with shocking strength. His fingers closed around her arm like a steel trap, and she could feel the raw power in his grip, the barely contained violence of a cornered animal. "Who sent you?" He growled, his voice rough with pain and suspicion. His grip tightened as his eyes darted around the forest, taking in his surroundings with the rapid tactical assessment of someone trained to evaluate threats. "You with Slade's crew?" Dot remained perfectly still despite her racing heart. She could feel the bones in her wrist grinding together under his grip, could feel the bruise already forming. But she did not cry out. She did not pull away. She had faced down angry parents, belligerent teenagers, and a school board that once tried to fire her for teaching a banned book. She was not about to be intimidated by a wounded man half out of his mind with pain. "I do not know any Slade," she said calmly, her voice as steady as a metronome. "I am just an old woman who found you while picking herbs. My name is Dorothy Caldwell. People call me Dot." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning her face for any sign of deception. His fingers remained locked around her wrist, though the crushing pressure lessened slightly as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. A small woman, silver hair beneath a gardening hat, a wicker basket full of mint and rosemary. No weapon, no threat. "You are lying," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice like water through a crack. "They would not send." He trailed off, wincing as a wave of pain overtook him. His face went gray and his grip on her wrist weakened. "I assure you, young man, I was not sent by anyone," Dot replied firmly. "Now, if you will release my wrist, I can continue cleaning that nasty cut on your head, unless you prefer to keep bleeding all over my good handkerchief." Something flickered in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall of suspicion. His fingers opened, and her wrist slid free. Dot resisted the urge to rub the sore joint and instead returned to cleaning his wound with the same unflappable calm. The man tried to push himself up from the ground, using the tree trunk for leverage. His legs wobbled beneath him like a newborn colt, and a sharp hiss of pain escaped through his clenched teeth as his ribs protested the movement. "Easy there," Dot said, reaching out to steady him with one hand on his massive shoulder. "You are in no shape to be moving fast." "I am fine," he growled, but his ashen face and shaking hands told a different story entirely. He swayed dangerously, nearly going down again, and Dot stepping closer, ignoring his weak attempt to wave her away. "Now listen here," she said, her voice taking on the firm, no-nonsense tone she had used with stubborn students for 4 decades. The tone that had made even the toughest 17-year-old football player sit down and pay attention. "You can barely stand, you are hurt bad, and night will be coming before long. My house is 15 minutes down that path. Let me help you get there." The man, who towered over her by a full foot and outweighed her by at least 150 pounds, looked down at the tiny woman beside him with an expression of pure bewilderment, as if she were speaking a language he had forgotten how to understand. "Lady, you do not know what you are getting into." "I am not." He paused, searching for words through the fog of pain. "I am not the kind of person you should be helping." "I think I will decide that for myself," Dot replied. She positioned herself under his arm, wedging her small frame against his side like a living crutch. Despite their difference in size, she planted her feet and stood firm, ready to bear his weight. "Now lean on me, and we will take it slow." He hesitated for a long moment. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, pride against pain, distrust against desperation. Then, with a sound that was half groan and half surrender, he allowed himself to rest some of his weight on her shoulder. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the craziest," he muttered. But there was less edge in his words now. The hostility was draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel, replaced by exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude. 40 years of teaching, teenagers, Dot said, adjusting her grip. After that, everything else is easy. They made their way through the woods, following the narrow dirt path that Dot had walked 1,000 times before. She kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks to distract him from the obvious pain of every step. That old red oak there has been standing since before I was born, she said, gesturing with her free hand. My husband Earl used to say it was older than the Republic itself. And just past those birch trees, you can sometimes spot deer in the early morning. A mother and two fawns were there last Tuesday. The man remained mostly silent, all of his concentration focused on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. Every few steps, he would stumble on a root or a stone, and Dot would tighten her grip with surprising strength for a woman her size, keeping him upright through sheer determination. Almost there, she announced as they rounded a familiar bend in the path. A small white farmhouse came into view, its wraparound porch decorated with hanging flower baskets overflowing with petunias and trailing ivy. The house sat in a clearing, surrounded by garden beds bursting with early vegetables, tomato cages and bean poles standing like sentinels in neat rows. A weathered barn sat off to one side, and wind chimes hung from the porch eaves, tinkling softly in the afternoon breeze. Just a few more steps, Dot encouraged. When they finally reached the porch stairs, the man was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool spring air. Dot helped him up the 3 steps and through the front door into a cozy living room that smelled of lavender and old books. Sit, she commanded, gesturing to an oversized armchair upholstered in worn green fabric. The same chair Earl had spent his last good years reading in. The man sank into the chair, his large frame making it look almost childlike. His eyes moved around the room with that same tactical awareness, taking in the family photographs on the mantel, the well-worn furniture with its quilted throws, the simple wooden cross hanging above the stone fireplace. Shelves lined one wall filled with books and small ceramic figurines and framed pictures of smiling children. Look, he said as Dot returned from the bathroom carrying a proper first aid kit, the big plastic box she kept stocked for emergencies. I appreciate the help, but I do not want any trouble coming to your door. Trouble tends to find its own way without any help from us. Dot replied, kneeling before him and opening the kit with practiced efficiency. Now hold still while I clean these wounds properly. You are not listening, he insisted, though he did not pull away as she began treating the gash on his forehead with antiseptic. The sharp sting made him flinch, but he held steady. The people who did this, they are not the kind you want anywhere near your life. Dot continued her work steady and methodical, cleaning each wound, applying antibiotic ointment, covering the worst cuts with butterfly bandages. She worked in silence for several minutes, her hands gentle but sure. When she finished with his head, she moved to the cuts on his arms, pushing up the torn sleeves of his shirt to expose more bruises and abrasions. It was then that she saw it. Beneath the gang tattoos partially hidden by a coiling dragon that wrapped around his left forearm, there was a different kind of ink. Older, simpler, a small insignia she recognized instantly, an eagle perched atop a globe and anchor. United States Marines. Her hands went still. Below the insignia in plain block letters were 2 words and a date, Helmand Province, 2014. Dot stared at those words for a long moment. The room seemed to shrink around her, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway growing louder in the silence. She thought of Wesley, her older brother, coming home from Korea in 1953 with that same 1,000-yard stare, that same flinching at loud noises, that same desperate need to feel something, anything besides the guilt of having survived when others did not. Wesley, who had drunk himself into an early grave by the time he was 50 because nobody knew what to call the darkness inside him. Nobody had a name for it back then. Nobody knew how to help. She looked up at the man in her husband's chair, and for the first time she did not see a Hell's Angel. She saw a soldier, a broken one, yes, lost and damaged and wrapped in the wrong kind of armor. But a soldier all the same. I have a guest bedroom upstairs, she said quietly, her voice carrying a new weight. Clean sheets, comfortable bed, you need rest to heal. The man stared at her, bewilderment written plain across his battered face. After a long, uncertain moment, he gave a slight nod. One night he conceded, but I am gone tomorrow. First light. We will see, Dodd said simply, continuing to tend his wounds with renewed tenderness. We will just see. His name, she learned over a bowl of chicken soup that evening, was Gunner. Gunner Tate. The name suited him, she thought, word and blunt, like the man himself. The kitchen filled with the simple aroma of chicken and herbs as Dot stirred the pot on her old gas stove. She had made this soup 100 times, maybe 1,000. It was Earl's mother's recipe handed down through generations of Caldwell women, and it had seen this family through everything from winter colds to funeral receptions. Gunnar appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking deeply uncomfortable in the borrowed clothes she had found in Earl's closet. The plaid flannel shirt stretched tight across his broad shoulders, and the khaki pants ended above his ankles. But they were clean and whole, a marked improvement over the blood-stained rags she had cut off him earlier. Sit. Gestured to the small kitchen table, already set with 2 bowls and 2 spoons. It is nothing fancy, just homemade chicken soup, but it will help you get your strength back. Gunnar lowered himself carefully into the chair, his cracked ribs clearly making every movement an exercise in controlled agony. His eyes fixed hungrily on the steaming bowl Dot placed in front of him, and she saw his jaw work as if he were fighting some internal battle between pride and need. "You did not have to do all this," he mumbled. "Nonsense. Everyone needs a good meal." Dot sat across from him, watching as he took his first spoonful. Her mother always said soup could cure anything. She was mostly right. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sound the quiet clink of spoons against ceramic bowls and the steady tick of the kitchen clock. Dot noticed how Gunnar's hands, despite their enormous size and the violent tattoos that covered them, handled the spoon with surprising care. There was a gentleness buried in there somewhere, hidden beneath all the ink and scar tissue. She decided to push gently, the way she had learned to push reluctant students toward the truth. So she ventured carefully, breaking the silence. "How long have you been with the motorcycle club?" Gunnar's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck going taut. For a moment, Dot thought he would not answer, that he would shut down the way so many wounded men did, pulling the silence around themselves like a shield. "5 years, he finally said. His voice was rough, like gravel dragged over concrete. "After I got back from my last tour overseas. Could not adjust to normal life anymore. Nothing made sense. Everything was too quiet or too loud. Could not hold a drum, could not sleep without seeing things I did not want to see. The club, they understood, did not ask questions, just handed me a vest and pointed me at the road." Dot nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Not judging, not pitying, just listening, the way she had listened to 10,000 students tell her their troubles over the years. "War changes people," she said softly. "My brother Wesley came back different from Korea. Never quite found his way back to who he was before." Something flickered in Gunnar's pale blue eyes. Recognition. Understanding. The faint light of someone realizing they are not as alone as they thought. He picked up his spoon again, took another bite before speaking. "What happened to him, your brother?" Dot was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, she could see the last light fading from the sky, turning the garden into a silhouette of stakes and leaves against deep purple. "He drank," she said simply. "For 20 years he drank, trying to quiet the noise in his head, trying to forget the faces of the boys he lost in that frozen valley they sent him to. He died at 50. Heart gave out. But honestly, I think his heart broke a long time before that. We just did not know what to call it back then." Gunnar said nothing, but his grip on the spoon tightened, and Dot saw something shift behind his eyes. A door opening, just a crack onto a room he had kept locked for a very long time. "The club," he said after a while. "They are not good people, and I am not a good person anymore, Mrs. Caldwell." "Dot," she corrected gently. "And good or bad, you are hurt and you needed help. That is all that matters right now." After dinner, Gunnar retreated to the guest bedroom upstairs, carrying the weight of their conversation with him, like stones in his pockets. Dot could hear him pacing above his heavy footsteps, marking the length of the small room over and over, a caged animal still measuring the walls. She settled onto the porch in her favorite rocking chair, the one that matched Earl's, which sat empty beside her as it had for 5 years. The night air was cool for late May, and stars scattered across the clear Tennessee sky like handfuls of crushed diamonds thrown against black velvet. Part of her wondered if she was being foolish. A 75-year-old woman living alone, taking in a Hell's Angel, she found chained to a tree in the woods. It sounded like the plot of one of those crime shows her neighbor Mrs. Peterson was always watching, the kind that ended with police tape and a body under a white sheet. But there was something in Gunnar's eyes, beneath the hardness and the pain and the practiced menace, that reminded her of Wesley in those early days after Korea. For the drinking took hold, before the darkness won. Someone lost and frightened, searching desperately for a way back to a world that had moved on without them. The porch boards creaked above as Gunnar continued his restless pacing. Then sometime around midnight, the pacing stopped. And through the old house's thin walls, Dot heard something that made her heart crack like a fault line. Gunnar was talking in his sleep. Not talking. Crying out. His voice, that deep, gravel-rough voice, had gone high and thin and desperate. The voice of a young man barely more than a boy, trapped in a nightmare he could not escape. Thompson, get down. Get down. He's hit. Medic. We need a medic over here. Rodriguez, stay with me. Stay with me, brother. Do not close your eyes. The names tumbled out of him like water through a broken dam. Thompson, Rodriguez, Vasquez. Names that meant nothing to Dot, but clearly meant everything to the man upstairs. She sat perfectly still in her rocking chair, listening to him fight a battle that had ended years ago but would never truly be over. When the crying out faded to quiet sobs, and the sobs faded to the uneven breathing of exhausted sleep, Dot finally allowed her own tears to fall. She cried silently, the way she had learned to cry during Earl's last months, when she needed to be strong in the daylight, but could not hold back the grief after dark. She cried for Gunnar. She cried for Wesley. She cried for all the broken young men who went to war and came home to find that the country they had fought for had no idea what to do with them. The next morning, Dot was up before dawn. She moved through her kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who has performed the same rituals for decades. Coffee on, bacon in the pan, eggs cracked into a blue ceramic bowl. She heard Gunnar come down the stairs, his steps slower and more careful than the night before. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking slightly better than the previous evening. The swelling around his left eye had gone down a fraction, though the bruises had ripened into deeper shades of purple and yellow. "Good morning," Dot called cheerfully, sliding eggs onto a plate beside 4 strips of bacon and 2 pieces of toast spread thick with her homemade strawberry jam. "I hope you are hungry. I am used to cooking for one, so it is a genuine pleasure to have someone to feed again." Gunnar eased himself into the chair, moving like a man 20 years older than his 35 years. "Smells good," he said quietly. That was all. But the way his eyes lingered on the plate, the way his hands reached for the fork without the hesitation of the night before, told Dot everything she needed to know. They ate together, and Dot talked. She talked about Earl, about how he used to sit in that very chair every morning with his newspaper complaining about the weather forecast and stealing bites of her jam toast when he thought she was not looking. She talked about her garden, about the tomatoes that would be coming in by July, and the herbs she dried in the fall. She talked about her Thursday quilting circle and the library where she read to kindergartners twice a week. Gunnar listened, really listened. Not the way most people listen, already forming their response before the other person finishes speaking, but with a deep, almost hungry attention, as if her ordinary stories of an ordinary life were something precious, something he had lost and forgotten even existed. After breakfast, Dot cleared the plates and stood at the sink, her back to him, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside her window. "Tell me what happened in those woods," she said. Not a demand, an invitation. "Tell me why someone chained you to that tree." The silence behind her stretched long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then she heard him exhale a long, slow breath that seemed to carry years of weight with it. "I was in Slade's crew." Slade is the chapter president, runs everything from drug distribution to protection rackets across 3 counties. He paused. "A few weeks back, he ordered me to torch a little grocery store on Route 12. Mom and pop place, run by an old woman named Ida Perkins, been there a lifetime of teaching. She was behind on the protection payments." Dot turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel. She said nothing, just waited. "I went to the store," Gunnar continued, his eyes fixed on the table. "Had the gasoline in the trunk, had the matches. Drove there at 2 in the morning, just like Slade told me. And I sat in that parking lot for an hour. Just sat there, thinking about Mrs. Perkins, thinking about how she always put out a jar of hard candy for the kids who came in with their parents, thinking about how she reminded me of someone." He looked up at Dot then, and his eyes were raw. "She reminded me of my grandmother, the only person who ever gave a damn about me when I was growing up." He swallowed hard. "I could not do it. I drove back and told Slade I would not burn an old woman's livelihood to the ground. Told him I was done. He took that about as well as you would expect." "Slade did this to you," Dot said. It was not a question. "Slade and 4 of his boys worked me over for about an hour in the warehouse. Then they drove me out to those woods, chained me up, and left. Slade told me I could sit there and think about loyalty until I changed my mind. Or until I did not. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. They had left him to die, chained to a tree in the middle of nowhere, beaten half to death, with no water and no way to call for help. If Dot had not gone walking that morning, if she had chosen a different path or decided to stay home and read, she pushed the thought away. Dwelling on what might have been was a luxury she could not afford. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, refusing to hurt that woman. That took more courage than anything Slade has ever done. Gunnar shook his head. "Courage has nothing to do with it. I am just tired. Tired of being the kind of man who does things like that. Tired of waking up and not recognizing myself in the mirror." Dot sat back down across from him and placed both of her weathered hands flat on the table. "Then stay," she said. "Stay here and rest, heal up properly, and figure out what kind of man you want to be next." Before he could argue, before he could list all the reasons why that was impossible, the phone rang. Dot reached for the receiver mounted on the kitchen wall, a relic from another era that she had never bothered to replace. She saw the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. "Marlene," she answered, forcing brightness into her voice. "What a wonderful surprise, sweetheart." Her daughter's voice crackled through the speaker, brisk and efficient as always. Marlene spoke the way she did everything, with the precise, organized energy of someone who managed spreadsheets and quarterly reports for a living. "Hi, Mom. I have been thinking. It has been way too long since we visited. Colton is on break from baseball, and Lily's recital was postponed. We thought we would drive up this weekend if that works." Dot's eyes darted to Gunnar, who was watching her with the alert stillness of an animal that has heard a twig snap. This weekend, Dot repeated, her mind racing. That was 3 days away. 3 days to figure out how to explain the 240-pound Hell's Angel sitting in her kitchen wearing her dead husband's clothes. "Unless it is not a good time," Marlene's voice sharpened slightly, the way it always did when she sensed her mother holding something back. "You are not too busy, are you?" "No. No," Dot said quickly. Too quickly, and she knew it even as the words left her mouth. "Of course not. You know I am always happy to see you and the children." "Good. We will aim for Friday evening around dinner time." There was a pause on the line, a beat of silence that mothers and daughters learned to fill with volumes of unspoken concern. "Mom, are you sure everything is all right? You sound different." Dot forced warmth into her voice with the skill of a woman who had spent decades managing parent-teacher conferences. "Everything is fine, honey. I have just been working in the garden all morning. You know how that wears me out sometimes." "I am not as young as I used to be." They exchanged a few more details about the visit. Marlene's husband would stay home for a work commitment. It would be just her and the grandchildren. 2 nights, maybe 3. After the call ended, Dot's hand trembled slightly as she returned the phone to its cradle. She stood there for a moment, her back to Gunnar, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and undo what had just been set in motion. "Your daughter," Gunnar said from the table. It was not a question. Dot nodded, turning to face him. "She is coming this weekend. Friday evening, with my grandchildren. Colton is 10, Lily is 7. She tried to smile, but it felt as thin as paper. Gunnar stood up from the table, wincing as his ribs reminded him of their condition. "I should go before they get here." "No," Dot said, and the force in her own voice surprised her. "That is not the answer." But even as she said it, worry knotted in her chest like a fist. She knew Marlene, knew her daughter's fierce protectiveness, her tendency to see threats everywhere, her deep conviction that her 75-year-old mother had no business living alone in the country, let alone harboring a man who looked like he had walked off the set of a prison documentary. Marlene had never approved of what she called her mother's stray dog syndrome. The way Dot had always taken in the troubled ones, the difficult students, the neighbors going through hard times, the stray cats and lost dogs that seemed to find their way to her door. But a stray cat was one thing. A Hell's Angel with gang tattoos and cracked ribs was something else entirely. The rest of the day passed in an uneasy quiet. Dot went through the motions of her routine gardening and cleaning and preparing the house for guests, but her mind churned with possible scenarios. She could almost hear Marlene's voice, see the fear in her daughter's eyes. Gunnar, for his part, retreated into himself. He spent the afternoon on the back porch, sitting in Earl's old chair, staring at the garden without really seeing it. Dot brought him lunch and iced tea and did not press him to talk. Some silences needed to be respected. By Thursday evening, the house gleamed. Dot had cleaned every surface, changed every sheet, and stocked the kitchen with Colton's favorite cereal and the specific brand of juice boxes Lily insisted on. She had also, without discussing it with Gunnar, prepared the guest room where he had been sleeping and moved his few possessions to the smaller room at the end of the hall, farther from the children's room. She found Gunnar sitting on the front porch steps as the sun went down, watching the fireflies begin their nightly performance across the yard. "You should stay," she said, settling onto the top step beside him. "I will handle Marlene." Gunnar shook his head slowly. "You do not know what you are asking. Your daughter takes one look at me and she calls the police. Or worse, she takes those kids and never brings them back." The words hit Dot like a slap because she knew he was right. That was exactly what Marlene would do. And the thought of losing those weekend visits, of Colton's bear hugs and Lily's endless questions, and the sound of children's laughter filling this too-quiet house, it made her chest ache with a physical pain. But she looked at Gunnar, really looked at him the way she had looked at Wesley all those years ago, and she saw the same thing. A man at a crossroads, a man who could still go either way. And she knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic that if she turned him away now, he would not survive. Maybe not physically, maybe not right away, but the fragile thing that had begun to grow in him over these few days, the tiny seed of hope that someone in this world might see him as more than his worst choices, that seed would die. And without it, so would he. Eventually, the same way Wesley had died, slowly and then all at once. "I will handle Marlene," she said again. And this time her voice carried the iron certainty of a woman who had made her decision and would not be moved from it. Friday evening arrived with the crunch of tires on gravel and the slamming of car doors. Dot barely had time to rise from her armchair before the front door burst open and her grandchildren exploded into the living room like a pair of small, joyful tornadoes. Grandma, Colton, all limbs and freckles and 10-year-old energy, crashed into her with a hug that nearly knocked her off her feet. Lily was right behind her, blonde pigtails, bouncing, her arms already outstretched. "My darlings," Dot held them both tight, breathing in the scent of grass and candy and childhood. "You have both grown so much. I swear you are taller every time I see you." Marlene appeared in the doorway behind them, and Dot watched her daughter's eyes perform their customary sweep of the room. It was something Marlene did every time she visited, a quick visual inventory of her mother's home, checking for signs of decline, of confusion, of the slow unraveling that she seemed to expect at any moment. The sweep paused on the motorcycle boots beside the front door, moved to the unfamiliar leather jacket hanging on the coat rack, and then inevitably landed on Gunnar. He stood near the fireplace, his massive frame impossible to miss, impossible to explain away. He had cleaned up as best he could. His beard was trimmed. He wore a fresh flannel shirt, but the tattoos crawled up his neck and across his knuckles, and the fading bruises on his face told their own story. Marlene's smile died on her lips. "Mom," she said, her voice going flat, "the house looks different." Her eyes had not left Gunnar. Colton, having already spotted the newcomer, stared with the unguarded fascination of a 10-year-old boy. "Whoa. Are those real tattoos?" Tommy, Marlene said sharply, using his middle name the way she always did when she meant business. "Why do you not take your sister and go unpack your bags from the car?" "But Mom, now, please." The children retreated reluctantly, their curiosity trailing behind them like a cape. The front door closed, and in the sudden heavy silence, Marlene turned to her mother with eyes that could have cut glass. Dot took a breath and stepped forward. "Marlene, this is Gunnar. He has been helping me with some repairs around the house." It was not a lie exactly. Gunnar had fixed the squeaky screen door that morning, a small offering of usefulness that Dot had gratefully accepted. Gunnar stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, the careful movements of a large man trying very hard not to appear threatening. "Ma'am," he said quietly with a small nod. His voice was stripped of everything but simple respect. Marlene nodded back, her lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly disappeared. "How nice," she said, and the two words dripped with so much ice they could have frozen the Tennessee River solid. "Mom, could you help me bring in the overnight bags?" Outside, standing beside the open trunk of Marlene's sensible sedan, away from the windows and the ears of children, the storm broke. "What are you thinking?" Marlene hissed, her voice low but vibrating with intensity. "Having a strange man living in your house? A man who looks like—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung between them sharp as a blade. He is not strange to me anymore, Dot said quietly, lifting a small suitcase from the trunk. He has been here for several days now. Several days, Marlene repeated, her voice climbing. And you did not think to mention this when I called, when you knew I was bringing your grandchildren into this house. Dot closed the trunk with a careful click. From inside the house, she could hear Colton's voice, high and excited, asking Gunnar something about motorcycles. And beneath it, Gunnar's deep, measured reply. Inside the dinner table became a battlefield. Dot had prepared a roast Earl's favorite recipe, the one she made for every family gathering. But the food might as well have been cardboard for all the attention anyone paid it. The children chattered happily, oblivious to the tension between the adults, while Marlene pushed her food in circles around her plate, and Gunnar sat with his shoulders hunched, trying to take up as little space as a man his size possibly could. Finally, Marlene set down her fork with a deliberate clink. Mom, we need to talk about this situation. Dot looked up from helping Lily cut her chicken. Not now, Marlene. This is not the time. When is the time? When something happens, when it is too late. Marlene's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. You are living alone with a complete stranger. A man who looks like he belongs in a... She caught herself, glanced at the children, and lowered her voice. This is not safe, Marlene. Dot set her own fork down and met her daughter's gaze across the table. That is quite enough. No, it is not enough. Marlene leaned forward, her accountant's mind already building the case, marshaling the evidence. You have always done this, Mom. Always. Taken in strays, tried to fix broken things, broken people. But this is different. This is dangerous. I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Dot said, her voice carrying a lifetime of teaching, of classroom authority. Gunnar has been nothing but respectful and helpful since he arrived. Mom, look at him. Marlene gestured toward Gunnar, who sat motionless, his eyes fixed on his plate. He is clearly involved in something criminal. Those tattoos, that motorcycle jacket by the door, that is enough. Dot's palm hit the table with a force that surprised everyone, including herself. The water glasses trembled. Lily's eyes went wide. Colton froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. I will not have you judging someone you do not know in my house. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of silence in every direction. Gunnar pushed back from the table slowly. His chair scraped against the old linoleum with a sound like a muffled apology. He stood towering over all of them, and for a moment in the harsh light of the kitchen, with his tattoos and his bruises and his sheer physical presence, Dot could see exactly what her daughter saw. A threat, a danger, a wolf at the door. Your daughter is right to worry, Gunnar said quietly, looking at Dot. His voice was stripped bare, no anger, no self-pity, just a bone-deep weariness. I am grateful for everything you have done, but I should not be here, not with your family. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. His heavy footsteps crossed the living room. The screen door opened and closed with its familiar squeak. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the Tennessee night. Lily's lower lip trembled. Where did the big man go? Grandma Dot stood up from the table. Her bones ached. Her heart ached worse. She looked at her daughter, at the righteous fear in Marlene's eyes, at the children's confused faces, at the empty chair where Gunnar had been sitting. And Dorothy Caldwell, who had spent 75 years learning when to bend and when to stand firm, made the decision that would change everything. Excuse me, she said to Marlene. Keep the children inside. Then she walked out the front door, down the porch steps, and into the dark. She found him at the end of the driveway, standing in the road with his hands shoved in his pockets, looking in both directions as if trying to decide which way to disappear. Come back inside, she said. Gunnar did not turn around. You heard your daughter? She is right. My daughter is scared, Dot said, walking closer. Fear makes people say hard things. I know that better than anyone. But I did not pull you off that tree just to let you walk into the dark. She stopped a few feet behind him, close enough to see his shoulders shaking slightly. This is my home, she said, her voice rising just enough to carry over the cricket song and the distant hoot of a barn owl. And I decide who stays under my roof. Not Slade, not Marlene, me. Gunnar turned then, and in the pale moonlight, she could see the tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. The tears of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone fight for him. Why, he asked, his voice breaking on the single syllable. Why do you even care? Dot looked up at this broken giant of a man, this wounded soldier wrapped in a biker's skin, and she gave him the only answer that mattered. Because someone should have cared about my brother Wesley. Someone should have been there when he came home from Korea, with the whole war still raging inside him. Someone should have pulled up a chair and handed him a bowl of soup and told him he was worth saving. But nobody did, and I lost him. She paused, letting the night air fill the space between them. I am not losing another one. Gunnar stood there for a long, trembling moment. Then slowly, like a tree yielding to wind, he nodded. They walked back toward the house together, their footsteps falling into rhythm on the gravel drive. The porch light glowed warm and gold through the darkness, and as they climbed the steps, Dot could see Marlene watching from the living room window, her face a complicated map of fear and frustration and something else. Something that might in time become understanding. But that was a battle for another day. Tonight, Dot had won the only fight that mattered. She had kept the door open. And in her experience, that was where every good thing started. With a door that stayed open even when the whole world said it should be shut. The morning after the confrontation, Dot woke to a house divided by silence. Marlene had taken the children to the Holiday Inn on Route 9, 15 minutes from the farmhouse. She had left without saying goodbye, just a text message on Dot's phone that read, "We will talk tomorrow." The period at the end of that sentence carried more weight than any exclamation point ever could. Dot sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at the empty chairs. 4 of them, all empty. The house felt hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside and scooped away everything warm. Upstairs, she could hear Gunnar moving around in the guest room. Slow, careful movements. The creak of the floorboard near the window where he liked to stand and look out at the garden. She wondered if he had slept at all. She knew she had not. By 8 o'clock, she heard him come down the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the small room. 2 people on opposite sides of a bridge that was still being built. "I made coffee," Dot said. "And there are eggs, if you want them." Gunnar nodded and lowered himself into the chair. The bruises on his face had shifted color overnight, the purples fading toward yellow at the edges, a map of healing that would take weeks to complete. He wrapped his hands around the mug she set in front of him and stared into the dark liquid as if it held answers. "Your daughter hates me," he said. "My daughter does not know you," Dot corrected gently, sitting across from him. "There is a difference, a large one." They ate breakfast in a quiet that was not quite comfortable but not hostile either. The kind of silence that settles between 2 people who have been through something difficult together and are still figuring out what comes next. After the dishes were cleared, Dot handed Gunnar a pair of Earl's old work gloves. "The back porch steps have been rotting for 2 years," she said. "I have been meaning to get them fixed. There are tools and lumber in the garage." Gunnar looked at the gloves in his hands and up at her. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes softened. A flicker of gratitude for the simplicity of the request. No heavy conversation, no probing questions, just work. Something solid and uncomplicated to do with his hands. He spent the morning tearing out the rotten boards and measuring new ones. Dot worked in the garden nearby, close enough for conversation, but far enough to give him space. The rhythm of hammer strikes and the rasp of the handsaw filled the warm Tennessee air, mixing with bird song and the distant hum of a tractor on the neighboring farm. Around mid-morning, as Dot knelt between rows of young tomato plants, Gunnar set down his hammer and spoke without turning around. "Afghanistan was not what I expected," he said, his voice carrying across the yard like stones skipping over water. "They tell you it is about freedom, about protecting people, and maybe it is at the start, but after a while it is just about keeping the guy next to you alive until tomorrow." Dot continued, weeding her hands, moving steadily through the soil. She did not look up. She had learned long ago that men like Gunnar, men like Wesley, talk more freely when they did not feel watched. "My unit was tight," he continued, "tighter than any family I had ever known. My mother died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer. My father, he just disappeared into the bottle after that. Drank his way through what was left of my childhood. I raised myself mostly. Joined the Marines the day I turned 18 because it was the only door that was open." He picked up a nail and turned it between his fingers, studying it as if it were something infinitely complex. "First tour was hard but manageable. I was young and stupid and thought I was invincible. Second tour was different. We were in Helmand province, Taliban country. Every road was a potential grave. Every doorway could be the last one you walk through. But we had each other. Thompson Rodriguez, Vasquez Kimball. We were brothers, not the kind who share blood, the kind who share everything else. Fear, food, letters from home, bad jokes at 3 in the morning when nobody could sleep. His voice cracked on the last word and he went quiet for a moment. A mockingbird sang from the fence post, filling the silence with its borrowed melodies. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. We had done that exact route maybe 100 times. I was on point. My job was to watch the road, read the ground, spot anything that did not belong. And I missed it. I walked right past it. The IED was buried under a pile of gravel that looked exactly like every other pile of gravel on that road. But it was not. He set the nail down on the porch railing with exaggerated care. The blast took Thompson and Vasquez instantly. Rodriguez made it to the helicopter, but he died on the table at the field hospital. Kimball lost both legs. And I walked away with nothing but a scratch on my forehead and a ringing in my ears that lasted 3 months. Dot's hands had gone still in the soil. She could hear the raw edge in his voice, the blade of guilt that had been cutting him from the inside for years. I was the point man, he said. It was my job to see it. My one job. And I missed it. 3 men dead because I missed a pile of gravel. He picked up the hammer again, but did not swing it. Just held it, as if feeling its weight. Coming home was worse than the war. Everything felt wrong. Too clean, too quiet, too normal. People walked around complaining about traffic and grocery prices, and I wanted to scream at them. I could not sleep without seeing their faces. Could not close my eyes without hearing the blast. The VA gave me pills, but the pills just made everything flat. Like living behind a pane of glass. You can see the world, but you cannot touch it. The gang offered something different, he said. A brotherhood that did not ask questions, did not care about my nightmares or my guilt, just gave me a road and a bike and a reason to keep moving. The violence, the drugs, it numbed everything for a while, made the noise in my head go quiet. But it never really went away. The weight of it, the names, the faces, you just learned to carry it differently. And one day you look in the mirror and you do not recognize the man staring back at you. Dot stood up slowly from her garden bed, brushing dirt from her knees. She walked to the porch and sat down on the step beside him. Not touching him, just close enough that he could feel her presence. Earl used to have nightmares too, she said quietly. Not from war, from the cancer. Near the end, he would dream that he was healthy again, that we were back on our sailboat at Norris Lake, and then he would wake up and remember. She paused. He said waking up was the cruelest part, having something beautiful taken away from you every single morning. Gunnar looked at her, his pale blue eyes bright with unshed tears. How did you survive that, he asked. Watching someone you love disappear like that. One day at a time, Dot said. Some days I would talk to him as if he were still here. Other days I would cry until there was nothing left. But slowly, so slowly, I almost did not notice I learned to live with the empty spaces. Not fill them, just live alongside them. Like learning to walk again after a broken leg. You never forget the break, but you learn to carry it. They sat together in the warm afternoon sun, the smell of earth and freshly cut lumber around them. Gunnar did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. I do not know how to carry it anymore, he said. The gang was the only thing holding me together. And now that is gone too. He looked down at his scarred hands. I have nothing left. That is not true, Dot said. She did not say it with pity or with forced cheerfulness. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, with quiet, unshakable conviction. You have right now, you have this porch, you have a hammer in your hand and work to do. And you have me, an old woman who is too stubborn to give up on people. Something broke in Gunnar's face then. The wall he had been building for years, the one made of anger and silence, and practiced indifference, developed a crack that ran from top to bottom. His massive shoulders began to shake. And there on the back porch of a farmhouse in rural Tennessee, surrounded by tomato plants and sawdust, and the ordinary sounds of a spring afternoon, This giant of a man wept. Dot placed her hand on his shoulder and held it there steady and warm as years of grief poured out of him in ragged, gasping sobs. She did not shush him, did not tell him everything would be fine. She simply stayed her presence, an anchor in the flood. They stayed that way for a long time until the shadows lengthened and the afternoon light turned to gold. Marlene came by the next morning with the children, not to stay, to observe. She parked at the end of the driveway and sat in the car for a full minute before getting out as if steeling herself for whatever she might find inside. Dot watched from the kitchen window and recognized the gesture. Marlene had done the same thing before every difficult meeting at work, according to the stories she told. Sat in the car, breathed, built her armor. When Marlene finally came inside, her eyes tracked Gunnar the way a bird watches a cat. Not with panic, but with a constant, measuring alertness. She positioned herself between the children in the living room, where Gunnar was reading an old paperback from Earl's shelf, and she kept her car keys in her hand for the first hour, ready to leave at any sign of trouble. But the children were oblivious to the adult tensions. Colton spotted Gunnar through the doorway within minutes and was immediately fascinated. The boy had the fearless curiosity of a 10-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of people who looked different. "What are you reading?" Colton asked, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. Gunnar looked up surprised. He glanced toward the kitchen where Marlene sat rigid at the table, then back at the boy. "Hemingway," he said. "The Old Man and the Sea. Is it good?" "It is about a man who catches a fish that is too big for his boat." Gunnar paused. "And about not giving up even when everything seems impossible." Colton considered this with the gravity of a child who takes stories seriously. "Cool," he said. Then he wandered outside and discovered the lumber and tools Gunnar had been using on the porch steps. By afternoon, Colton was helping Gunnar measure boards, his small hands holding the tape measure, while Gunnar marked the cuts with a carpenter's pencil. The boy's face was bright with the particular joy of being trusted with a real task. Lily sat on the top step drawing pictures with her crayons, occasionally looking up to announce that she was making a portrait of the big man with the pretty arm drawings. She had given him green hair and wings which she insisted were accurate. Gunnar was patient with them both, answering Colton's questions with quiet care and holding perfectly still when Lily demanded he roll up his sleeves so she could get the tattoo colors right. He moved carefully around the children, the way a large dog moves around kittens, aware of every step and every gesture, making himself smaller and softer without ever being asked. Dot watched from the kitchen window, her heart swelling at the sight, even as her mind raced with worry. Beside her, Marlene stood with a coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips, watching the same scene. Neither of them spoke, but Dot noticed that Marlene had finally put her car keys down on the counter. Because Dot knew what was coming. She could feel it the way old bones feel a change in weather, a pressure drop in the atmosphere of her life that meant a storm was building somewhere just beyond the horizon. It came 3 nights later. Dot was in bed, not yet asleep when she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the Tennessee night. Not a cricket or an owl or the settling of an old house. A low rumble, distant but growing closer. The unmistakable growl of a motorcycle engine. She sat up in bed, her heart immediately hammering. Through her bedroom window, she could see the beam of a single headlight cutting through the darkness at the end of her driveway. The engine cut off abruptly, and silence rushed back in like water filling a hole. Then footsteps, heavy boots on gravel, coming toward the house. Dot reached for her robe and slipped it on with trembling hands. She moved to the hallway and found Gunnar already there, standing at the top of the stairs. He was fully dressed, as if he had been expecting this. His face was hard as granite in the dim light. "Stay up here," he whispered. "No," she whispered back, and the single word carried enough steel to stop him mid-step. They went downstairs together. The knock came sharp and deliberate. 3 strikes against the front door, each one measured and unhurried. The knock of someone who was not asking permission, but making an announcement. A cold voice sliced through the wood like a blade. "I know you are in there, Gunnar. Open up." Gunnar's hand found the doorknob. He paused, looked back at Dot, and she saw something in his eyes she had not seen before. Not fear exactly. Something closer to resignation. The look of a man who had been running from an inevitable moment and had finally run out of road. He opened the door. The man on the porch was tall, nearly as tall as Gunnar, but leaner, built like a blade rather than a hammer. His head was shaved close to the scalp, and his dark eyes held a flat reptilian calm that made Dot's skin crawl. Tattoos crawled up his neck and across the backs of his hands. He wore a leather vest identical to the one Gunnar had been wearing in the woods, but cleaner. Better kept. The vest of a man who gave orders rather than followed them. Slade, Gunnar said. His voice was flat as a stone. Slade's thin lips stretched into something that was less a smile than a showing of teeth. Well, well, look at you, playing house. His dark eyes slid past Gunnar into the warm living room behind him, and when they found Dot standing near the fireplace, they lingered with an amusement that made her blood run cold. Nice setup, he said. Got yourself a little grandmother. She baked cookies for you, too. Leave her out of this, Gunnar said. The words came out low and hard, edged with warning. Say what you came to say. Slade's amusement vanished like a light switching off. His face went flat and businesslike. Boss wants you back, he said. The simplicity of the statement was more threatening than any elaborate threat could have been. You have had your little vacation, played in the dirt, ate some home cooking. Time to come home now. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a register that was almost intimate. You know how this works, brother. Nobody walks away. You took the oath. You wore the patch. You are ours until we say different. Dot had been watching from inside, gripping the back of Earl's armchair so tightly her knuckles were white. She could not stay silent any longer. She released the chair and walked to the doorway, stepping past Gunnar, despite his attempt to block her with his arm. This is my home, she said, looking directly into Slade's flat, dark eyes. And you are not welcome here. For a fraction of a second, something like surprise flickered across Slade's face. Then it was gone, replaced by that same cold amusement. With all due respect, ma'am, this is not your business. Your boy here has obligations, debts to pay. I am not going back, Gunnar said. The words were firm but not aggressive. The statement of a man drawing a line. That life is behind me. Is it? Slade's hand moved slowly, deliberately to his jacket pocket. He pulled out a manila envelope and held it up between two fingers. Then he tossed it onto the porch between them. It landed with a soft slap against the wood. Have a look, Slade said. Gunnar picked up the envelope. Dot watched his face as he opened it, and what she saw there turned her blood to ice. All the color drained from his skin. His hands began to shake. He stared at the contents for a long, terrible moment, then looked up at Slade with an expression that was equal parts horror and rage. Dot stepped forward and took the envelope from Gunnar's trembling hands. Inside were photographs. 3 of them, printed on glossy paper. The first showed Marlene pushing a shopping cart through the parking lot of the Kroger on Main Street. The second showed Colton kicking a soccer ball at Jefferson Park, his face bright with laughter. The third showed Lily climbing the jungle gym, her blonde pigtails flying behind her. All 3 photos had been taken with a telephoto lens, close enough to see the freckles on Colton's nose, close enough to read the logo on Lily's t-shirt. Dot's hands went steady, very steady, the kind of steady that comes not from calm but from a fury so deep and so cold that it burns past fear and out the other side into something like clarity. She looked up at Slade. Get off my porch, she said. Her voice was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The voice of a woman who had stared down death when it came for her husband, who had buried her brother and her best friend and the life she had planned, and who had learned that the worst thing the world can do to you is not kill you, but make you afraid to live. Slade seemed amused by her reaction, seemed to find something entertaining about this small, silver-haired woman standing in her nightgown on a country porch holding photographs of her grandchildren taken by a predator. You have got 48 hours, he said, looking past her at Gunnar. Come back willingly or we come get you. And when we come, we will not be polite about it. He glanced at the photos in Dot's hands. Pretty grandkids, by the way. Be a shame if something interrupted all that soccer and playground time. Gunnar lunged forward, but Dot threw her arm out, catching him across the chest with a strength that surprised them both. No, she said, not like this. Slade smiled that terrible empty smile one last time, then turned and walked into the darkness. The motorcycle engine roared to life, and within seconds the night swallowed him whole. Only the fading rumble of the exhaust and the smell of gasoline remained. When Gunnar closed the door, his face was a mask of anguish. I have to leave, he said. Tonight, right now, I will lead them away from here. away from your family. Dot stood in the middle of her living room, still holding the photographs. She looked at the image of Lily on the jungle gym, her granddaughter's face bright and trusting and completely unaware that someone had been watching her through a camera lens. Something shifted inside Dot then, something fundamental. The fear was still there, but it had been pushed aside by something older and fiercer. The same instinct that had driven her into the woods that first morning. The same force that had made her kneel beside a bleeding stranger and work the knots from his chains. She set the photographs face down on the coffee table. "Sit down," she said to Gunnar. "Dot, I cannot stay here knowing they are watching your family. I will not be the reason something happens to those kids. Sit down," she said again. And this time the voice was not the gentle voice of a grandmother or the patient voice of a teacher. It was the voice of a woman who had survived the death of a brother, the death of a husband, 4 decades of managing other people's children, and 75 years of a world that consistently underestimated her. It was the voice of Dorothy Caldwell, and it did not waver. Gunnar sat. Dot did not sit. She paced slowly in front of the fireplace the way she used to pace before her classroom when she was building toward the most important lesson of the semester. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her chin raised, her mind working with the cold, clean precision that had always been her greatest weapon. "Running is what they want," she said. "Think about it. If you run, they follow. They catch you, and they either drag you back or they make an example of you. And then they come here anyway because now they know about me, about Marlene, about the children. Running does not protect us. It just delays the inevitable. I have been teaching long enough to know that bullies do not stop when you retreat. They stop when you make it cost more to continue than to walk away." "Then what do you suggest?" Gunnar asked, his voice hollow. "I cannot fight them." "Not all of them. Slade has 20 men, maybe more." Dot stopped pacing. She stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her, and when she spoke there was a quality to her voice that Gunnar had not heard before. A precision, a sharpness. The voice of a woman whose mind was not frozen by fear, but accelerated by it. "You said Slade runs protection rackets," she said, "that he forces local businesses to pay for so-called security." Gunnar nodded. "Half the shops in 2 counties are paying him. Those that refuse get burned, or worse. And you mentioned he has been expanding, buying property, opening businesses of his own, laundromats, car washes, a bar on Route 4. Gunnar frowned. "How do you remember all that? I barely mentioned it." Dot gave him a look that would have been familiar to any of her former students. The look that said, "I was listening even when you thought I was not." A man who runs protection rackets does not buy laundromats because he loves clean clothes, she said. He buys them because they are perfect for washing something else. Money. She let the words settle between them. Cash-heavy businesses with hard-to-verify customer counts. Classic money laundering. I may be old, Gunnar, but I read. I watched the news. And I taught economics for 15 years before I switched to English. Gunnar stared at her. "You think Slade is laundering money?" "I do not think it. I know it. And so do you if you are honest with yourself. You were inside that organization for 5 years. You saw things, heard things, knew things you probably tried not to think about. The silence that followed was heavy with implication." Gunnar's face had gone still, his eyes distant as if he were reviewing years of memories through a new lens. "There were ledgers," he said slowly. "Slade kept everything in old-fashioned books. Did not trust computers. Said digital records were a trail that led straight to prison. He kept the books in a safe at the warehouse on Miller Road." Dot nodded. She moved to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one where she kept her stationery and her reading glasses, and sat down as if she were sitting down to grade papers. She pulled a notepad toward her and picked up a pen. "Tell me everything you know," she said. "Every business, every name, every number you can remember. We are not going to run from these people, Gunnar, and we are not going to fight them with fists. We are going to fight them with the truth." Gunnar leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "There is another way," he said. "Boomer, real name is Carl Raines. He has been with the club almost as long as I have. But he has been trying to get out for the past year. His wife left him, took the kids, told him she would not let him see them until he was clean." "Do you trust him?" Dot asked. "With my life," Gunnar said. "He is the only one in that whole crew who still has a conscience. And he has access. He runs the warehouse where Slade keeps the books. Can you contact him safely? Gunnar considered this. There is a burner phone protocol we set up months ago. For emergencies, Slade does not know about it. Then call him, Dot said. Tomorrow. Find out if he can get us copies of those ledgers. She set down her pen and looked at Gunnar with an expression of quiet intensity. But first I need to make a call of my own. She dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a deep, groggy voice answered. Sheriff Brannigan's office. This had better be good. It is 3 in the morning. Roy Dot said. It is Dorothy Caldwell. A pause, then the voice changed, sharpening with recognition and a warmth that cut through the professional gruffness. Mrs. Caldwell, is everything all right? Dot smiled in spite of everything. Roy Brannigan, 52 years old now, but in her mind he was still the scrawny, underfed boy who had shown up in her 3rd grade classroom in 1981, wearing shoes 2 sizes too big and pants held up with a piece of rope. The poorest child in the county, a boy who could barely write his own name. A boy the other teachers had written off as slow. But Dot had not written him off. She had kept him after school 3 days a week for 2 years straight, teaching him to read with the kind of patient, relentless attention that she brought to everything. By 5th grade, Roy Brannigan was reading at a 7th grade level. By high school, he was class president. He went to community college on a scholarship Dot had helped him apply for, and he came home to Cedar Hollow to become the law. He had been sheriff for 12 years now, and he still called her Mrs. Caldwell because some things a boy learns in 3rd grade never change. No, Roy, she said. Everything is not all right, and I need your help, not as my former student, as the sheriff of this county. She told him everything, calmly, methodically, the way she used to lay out lesson plans building from foundation to conclusion with no wasted words. She told him about finding Gunnar, about Slade, about the photographs of her grandchildren, and about her suspicion that Slade's operation extended far beyond local intimidation into a systematic money laundering enterprise. Brannigan listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. Mrs. Caldwell, he said carefully, what you are describing is serious, federal-level serious. If Slade is laundering money at the scale you are suggesting that falls under FinCEN regulations in the Patriot Act. I know what it falls under, Dot said crisply. I also know that you cannot build a case without evidence, and I believe I know how to get it. She outlined her plan. Gunnar contacts Boomer. Boomer photographs the ledgers. The evidence goes to Brannigan, who escalates to the FBI field office in Knoxville. Meanwhile, Brannigan increases patrols near Dot's property in Marlene's hotel. Nothing overt, nothing that tips Slade off, just enough presence to buy them time. When she finished, Brannigan let out a long breath. You have thought this through, he said. I am a teacher, Roy. Preparation is what I do. There is risk, he warned. Significant risk. If Slade finds out before we have the evidence locked down, things could escalate fast. Things have already escalated, Dot replied. He photographed my grandchildren. She let that sentence land with its full weight. There is no safe option here. Only less dangerous ones. Brannigan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Dot would remember for the rest of her life. You know, Mrs. Caldwell, you are the reason I became a lawman. You taught me that doing the right thing and doing the easy thing are almost never the same thing. He paused. I am in. Tell me what you need. After the call, Dot sat at her desk for a long time. The house was silent around her. Gunnar had gone to the kitchen, and she could hear him making coffee, the mundane sounds of spoon against ceramic somehow grounding her in the present moment. She looked down at the notepad in front of her. Names, numbers, addresses, the skeleton of a case that could dismantle Slade's operation. It was not much yet, but it was a start. The next 2 days moved with a tension that hummed beneath every ordinary action. Gunnar contacted Boomer through the burner phone protocol. The conversation was brief and coded, but the message was clear. Boomer was willing to help. He would photograph the ledgers during his next warehouse shift 2 days from now. Meanwhile, Dot noticed the subtle changes in her neighborhood. A county sheriff's cruiser that drove past her house twice a day instead of the usual once a week. Brannigan himself stopping by on his regular rounds to chat over the fence, his easy manner masking the sharp assessment in his eyes. Marlene continued her daily visits with the children, and Dot said nothing about the photographs or the plan. She could not risk involving her daughter. Not yet. The less Marlene knew, the safer she was. But Marlene was not a woman who missed details. On the third morning, she arrived earlier than expected and found Dot at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, her reading glasses perched on her nose. The laptop Earl had bought her open to a page about the Bank Secrecy Act and FinCEN reporting requirements. Mom, Marlene said from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Dot looked up. For a moment, she considered lying, considered shuffling the papers away and making some excuse about paying bills or researching a new recipe. But this was her daughter. Marlene, who had inherited Earl's analytical mind and Dot's stubborn streak. Marlene, who could read a balance sheet the way Dot could read a child's face and who would not be fooled by any story her mother could construct. "Sit down," Dot said. "There is something I need to tell you." She told Marlene about Slade's visit, about the photographs, and about what she believed Slade was really doing with his network of cash businesses. She did not tell her about the plan to obtain the ledgers. Not yet. Marlene's face went through a remarkable transformation during the telling. Shock first, then fear, then a cold fury that Dot recognized because it was the same expression she saw in her own mirror. "He photographed my children," Marlene said. The words came out flat and precise like numbers in an audit. "He stood outside their school and photographed my children." "Yes," Dot said. Marlene was quiet for a very long time. Her eyes moved across the papers spread on the table. The legal research, the notes, the list of Slade's businesses, and slowly, so slowly that Dot could almost see the gears turning, Marlene's expression shifted from fear to something harder, something focused. "These are businesses," Marlene said, pulling one of the pages toward her. "Laundromats, car washes, a bar." She looked up at her mother. "You think he is laundering money through them?" "I am certain of it." Marlene stared at her mother for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair next to Dot and sat down. She reached into her purse and withdrew a pair of reading glasses, nearly identical to her mother's. "Put them on," and began to read. "If he is running cash through these businesses," she said, her voice taking on the precise clipped tone she used in her professional life, "there will be patterns. Discrepancies between reported revenue and actual capacity. A laundromat can only service so many loads per day. A car wash can only wash so many cars. If his reported income exceeds what those businesses could physically generate, that is your evidence." Dot watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and relief so powerful it nearly brought her to tears. This was the daughter she had raised, not the frightened woman who wanted to hide behind locked doors, but the sharp, brilliant, stubborn woman who looked a problem in the eye and started solving it. "Mom," Marlene said, looking up from the papers, "if you can get me the actual financial records, I can prove what he is doing. I can build a case that no prosecutor could ignore." Dot reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." The ledgers arrived on a Tuesday evening. Boomer had done his work with the desperate efficiency of a man who knew he was betting everything on a single throw. 27 photographs of handwritten pages delivered to Gunner's burner phone and immediately transferred to Dot's laptop. Each page was dense with numbers, dates, and cryptic abbreviations that would have been meaningless to most people, but not to Marlene. She spread the printed photographs across Dot's dining room table and went to work with the focused intensity of a surgeon. For 3 days, she barely slept. Coffee cups accumulated around her like a paper city. She cross-referenced Slade's handwritten figures against public business filings, county tax records, and the physical capacity of each establishment. The picture that emerged was devastating. Slade's laundromat on Birch Street reported washing 1,200 loads per week. The machines could physically handle 300. His car wash on Route 4 claimed revenue that would require washing a car every 90 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The bar reported liquor purchases that would have required every resident in the county to drink 3 bottles of whiskey per month. "It is not even sophisticated," Marlene said, shaking her head in disbelief as she circled another discrepancy with her red pen. "He is just inflating the numbers and hoping nobody checks the math. Nobody asks questions because everybody is afraid of him." She tapped the stack of annotated photographs with her pen. "But numbers do not lie, Mom. Numbers never lie. And these numbers are screaming." She pulled out her laptop and began building a spreadsheet cross-referencing Slade's reported figures with county water bills, electrical usage records, and supplier invoices that Boomer had also photographed. Each new data point was another nail in the coffin of Slade's operation. The water usage alone told the story. You cannot wash 1,200 loads of laundry with the water bill of a household of three. Marlene looked at Dot with something new in her eyes, something that went beyond the grudging respect of a daughter for her mother, something closer to awe. This is systematic money laundering, she said. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions over the past few years. FinCEN requires currency transaction reports for anything over $10,000, and he has been structuring deposits to stay just under the threshold. That alone is a federal crime. She paused, set down her pen, and looked her mother straight in the eye. Mom, you were right. About all of it. About him, about the money, about Gunnar, about everything. Dot poured her daughter another cup of coffee and set it beside the growing stack of annotated printouts. I am usually right, she said. It just takes people a while to notice. For the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Hollow, Marlene laughed. A real laugh surprised out of her by her mother's deadpan delivery. And sitting at the kitchen table, Gunnar heard it and looked up from the porch step he was sanding, and something in his expression eased. Not much, but enough. That evening, the three of them sat together around the dining table. Dot, Marlene, and Gunnar, the photographs and spreadsheets pushed to one side. A simple dinner of meatloaf and green beans in the center. And for the first time, they ate together without tension, without suspicion, without the invisible wall that had stood between Marlene and Gunnar since the moment she first saw him. I was wrong about you, Marlene said to Gunnar, not looking up from her plate. She was not a woman who found apologies easy. The words came out stiff, almost formal, but they were genuine. I judged you before I knew your story. I am sorry for that. Gunnar set down his fork. You were protecting your family, he said. I would have done the same. Marlene finally looked up and met his eyes. I can see now why Mom took you in, she said, and I can see what it cost you to walk away from that life. She glanced at the stack of evidence on the sideboard. We are going to make sure that sacrifice means something. The phone rang at 9 that evening. Dot answered it on the second ring. Mrs. Caldwell Brannigan's voice was tight. We have a problem. Dot's hand tightened on the receiver. She turned away from the table, lowering her voice. What kind of problem? Slade knows about Boomer. I do not know how. Someone talked or he noticed the books were disturbed. Either way, Boomer is not answering his phone. And 20 minutes ago, Gunnar received a text. Dot looked across the room. Gunnar was already holding his phone, his face drained of color. He held it up so she could read the screen. The message was from Slade's number. 5 words and an address. Boomer is with me. Route 7 gas station. Midnight. Come alone, or your friend learns what happens to traitors. Dot read the message twice. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall above her, marking seconds that suddenly felt like they were running out. Gunnar stood up. His face had gone hard again, all the softness of the past days retreating behind the armor he had worn for 5 years. He was already reaching for his jacket. I have to go, he said. No, Dot said. The word was absolute, final. A door slamming shut on a path she would not allow him to take. We do this my way, the way we planned. There is no time for plans, Gunnar said. Boomer is going to die if I do not show up. Dot looked at him across the kitchen table, across the evidence of Slade's crimes, across the remains of the first peaceful meal they had shared as something like a family. She looked at the stack of Marlene's meticulous spreadsheets, at the photographs of her grandchildren that still lay face down on the coffee table in the living room, at the man sitting before her, this broken soldier who had walked into her life chained to a tree and who now sat in her husband's chair as if he had always belonged there. She thought about Wesley, about what might have happened if someone had fought for him the way she was fighting now, if someone had refused to let him disappear into the darkness. Then we had better move quickly, she said, because I am not letting you walk in there alone, and I am not letting Boomer die. She stood up from the table with a decisiveness that made her seem 10 years younger and 6 inches taller. She picked up the phone and dialed Brannigan's number. Her hand was steady, her voice was clear. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through contingencies the way she used to run, through lesson plans, anticipating every question, every objection, every possible point of failure. Roy, she said, when he answered, it is time. Get your people to the old Sinclair station on Route 7. We are doing this tonight. She hung up the phone and turned to Gunnar. Go get your boots on, she said, and then come back down here and listen carefully, because here is exactly what we are going to do. The old Sinclair, station on Route 7, had been dead for 15 years. Its pumps stood like rusted sentinels in the gravel lot, their dials frozen at prices that belonged to another decade. The canopy above them sagged in the middle, held up more by habit than by engineering. Plywood covered the windows of the station building, and kudzu had begun its slow invasion up the eastern wall, swallowing the brickwork one tendril at a time. It was the kind of place that existed in every small town in rural America. Forgotten by commerce, but remembered by teenagers looking for a place to drink beer, and by men who preferred to conduct their business away from witnesses. At 11:15 on a Tuesday night, Dorothy Caldwell sat in the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, parked on a dirt turnoff a quarter-mile from the station. The engine was off. The headlights were dark. Through the windshield, she could see the faint glow of a bare bulb inside the station building, the only light for miles in any direction. Gunner's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. "Go through it again," Dot said. Her voice was steady the way a surgeon's hands are steady. Not because there is no fear, but because the fear has been acknowledged and set aside in favor of the work that needs doing. Gunner exhaled slowly. Brannigan has 2 deputies in the tree line on the north side, 2 more behind the old fuel tanks on the south. Brannigan himself is in an unmarked truck on the access road behind the station. State police have a unit on Route 7 2 miles east, ready to block the highway if anyone tries to run. And the recording device, Dot said. Gunner reached into the center console and pulled out a small black box, no larger than a deck of playing cards. Brannigan had delivered it that afternoon along with careful instructions. Digital recorder, 12-hour battery, voice activated, range of 50 feet in open air. Gunner turned it over in his hands, then looked at Dot. "This should be me in there," he said. "Not you. This is insane if you walk in there," Dot said calmly. "Slay will be on guard. He knows you. He knows what you are capable of. He will measure every word because he sees you as a threat." She paused, letting the silence fill the cab. "But me, I am a 75-year-old woman in a cardigan. He will not measure a single word because he does not believe I am worth measuring. That is his weakness, and we are going to use it." Gunner shook his head. "If something goes wrong in there." "Then you come in," Dot said. "That is the plan. I go first. I talk. I give him room to say things he should not say. And if at any point things go sideways, you are 30 seconds behind me, along with 5 armed law enforcement officers." She reached over and placed her hand on his forearm. "I have been walking into rooms full of people who underestimate me for 4 decades. This is not so different." Gunner stared at her for a long moment. In the faint moonlight filtering through the windshield, his face was a landscape of competing emotions. Fear, admiration, doubt, and something else, something that looked almost like faith. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met," he said. "I prefer the word determined," Dot replied. "Now hand me that recorder." She tucked the device into the inside pocket of her cardigan, the same faded blue cardigan she wore to her Thursday quilting circle. She checked her watch. 11:28, 32 minutes until midnight. "I'm going to drive up now," she said. "Park out front where they can see me. You wait exactly 10 minutes, then pull around to the back of the building and come in through the service entrance. Brannigan's people will not move until they hear the signal." "What signal?" Gunner asked. Dot opened the passenger door and stepped out into the cool Tennessee night. The air smelled of pine and damp earth and the faintest trace of old gasoline. She looked back at Gunner through the open door. "You will know it when you hear it," she said. Then she closed the door and walked around to the driver's side of the truck. For a moment, standing alone in the dark on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, Dorothy Caldwell allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was about to do. The fear was enormous. It pressed against her chest like a stone, made her knees feel watery and her hands feel cold. She thought about Earl, about what he would say if he could see her now. She thought about Wesley, about the boy he had been before Korea took him apart, about the man he might have become if someone had fought hard enough to save him. She thought about Gunner, who had fought for his country and been abandoned by it, who had lost himself in the only darkness that would have him, who had been chained to a tree and left to die by men he called brothers, and who, despite all of that, had refused to burn an old woman's grocery store because somewhere inside the wreckage of his life, A small, stubborn flame of decency had refused to go out. That flame was worth protecting. It was worth fighting for. It was worth walking into a building full of dangerous men at midnight on a Tuesday for. Dot climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted the mirror and started the engine. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness as she drove the quarter-mile to the station. She pulled into the gravel lot and parked directly under the sagging canopy, making no attempt at stealth. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled. Through the plywood-covered windows, she could see movement inside, shadows shifting behind the cracks. She got out of the truck and walked toward the front door. Her shoes crunched on the gravel with each step, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent night. Her heart hammered against the recorder in her pocket, and she wondered briefly if the device was sensitive enough to pick up a heartbeat through woolen cotton. The door was a metal slab, dented and scarred, hanging slightly off its hinges. It stood ajar, a wedge of dirty yellow light spilling out onto the concrete step. Dot pushed it open and walked inside. The station's interior was a single large room that smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke, and something sour underneath. A fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, casting everything in a flat, unflattering light. Empty shelving units lined the walls. A counter with a dead cash register stood against the far wall, and in the center of the room, 3 men waited. Slade stood closest, leaning against the support column with his arms crossed. His 2 men flanked him, one on each side, their leather vests identical to his, their faces set in expressions of practiced menace. Behind them, in a folding chair near the back wall, sat a 4th man. Boomer, Carl Raines. His hands were zip-tied in front of him, and his left eye was swollen shut. Blood had dried on his chin from a split lip, and his shoulders were hunched with the particular posture of a man who has been hit many times and is waiting to be hit again. Slade's face when he saw Dot was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The flat reptilian calm fractured for exactly 1 second, replaced by genuine confusion. He had been expecting Gunner. He had been expecting a confrontation between men conducted in the language of violence that he understood and controlled. What he got instead was a small woman in a blue cardigan and sensible shoes walking into his domain as if she were walking into a library. "What is this?" Slade said. His voice was sharp with suspicion, but underneath the sharpness, Dot could hear something else. Amusement. The cruel, lazy amusement of a man who has never been challenged by anything he could not crush with his hands. "Good evening," Dot said. She stopped about 10 feet from Slade and folded her hands in front of her. The same posture she used at the beginning of every school year, standing before a new class of students who did not yet know what to make of her. "My name is Dorothy Caldwell. I believe you visited my home recently." Slade's lip curled. "I remember you." "Grandma." He looked past her toward the door. "Where is Gunner?" "Gunner is not coming," Dot said. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." This seemed to amuse Slade further. He exchanged a glance with his 2 men, and one of them snorted with barely concealed laughter. "Talk," Slade repeated as if the word itself were a joke. "You want to talk? Lady, you have no idea where you are right now." He pushed off the column and took a step toward her. "This is not a Sunday school class. You cannot talk your way out of this." "I am not trying to talk my way out of anything," Dot said. She kept her voice calm, conversational, the same tone she used when a student was trying to intimidate her with attitude and bluster. "I am trying to understand something, and I am hoping you can help me." Slade stopped, thrown off balance by her composure. He had expected fear. He had expected pleading. He had prepared himself for the satisfaction of watching an old woman beg. But Dot was not begging. She was standing in front of him with the serene confidence of someone who had the upper hand, and it unsettled him in a way he could not quite name. "Understand what he said. Why," Dot said simply, "why you do what you do. You are obviously an intelligent man. You have built something here. An organization. A network." She gestured vaguely around the room. "That takes planning. Strategy. Those are not small skills." Something shifted in Slade's expression. A flicker of vanity, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. Dot saw it the way a fisherman sees a ripple on still water. She had found the hook. Now she needed to set it. "Gunner told me a little about how things work," she continued, her voice taking on a note of genuine curiosity. "The businesses, the logistics. But he was always on the operational side. He never really understood the bigger picture, did he?" Slade's chin lifted slightly. The vanity flicker returned stronger this time. Gunner was muscle, he said. Good at following orders, not so good at thinking. But you are the thinker, Dot said. That much is obvious. It was the simplest manipulation in the book. The same technique she had used on thousands of teenagers over the decades. Find the ego, feed it, let it do the work for you. Most people, when given the chance to talk about their own brilliance, cannot resist the invitation. And men like Slade, men who built their power on the fear and silence of others, were especially hungry for an audience that could appreciate what they had built. Slade glanced at his men, then back at Dot. His posture relaxed by a fraction. You want to know how it works, he said. It was not quite a question. I am curious, Dot said. The laundromats, the car wash, the bar. That is not just a motorcycle club running petty crime. That is a business, a real one. The words landed exactly where she intended them, on the soft, unprotected center of Slade's pride. He had spent years building his operation, and nobody had ever acknowledged it as the sophisticated enterprise he believed it to be. His own men were too afraid to comment on it. The people he extorted were too terrorized to analyze it. And here was this old woman standing in his stronghold at midnight, looking at him not with fear, but with what appeared to be genuine intellectual respect. It was irresistible. Most people do not understand, Slade said, and there was a new energy in his voice now. A warmth almost. The warmth of a man finally being seen. They think it is all about the bikes and the patches and the tough guy act, but that is just the surface. Underneath is a machine. He began to pace his hands, moving as he talked. The laundromat alone moves $40,000 a month. Clean money out, dirty money in. Same with the car wash. The bar is a little different. Higher overhead. But the liquor distribution deal, that is where the real margin lives. He caught himself a flicker of wariness crossing his face. But Dot leaned forward slightly, her expression attentive and impressed, and the wariness dissolved. Go on, she said. Slade talked for 7 minutes. 7 minutes during which the recorder in Dot's pocket captured every word with digital clarity. He talked about the protection rackets that generated the cash, about the shell companies that moved it, about the property purchases designed to create additional laundering channels. He talked about the county officials. He had compromised the building inspector who looked the other way, the bank manager who processed deposits without filing the required currency transaction reports. He talked because Dot made it easy. She asked the right questions at the right moments. She nodded in the right places. She made small sounds of understanding that encouraged him to keep going. 40 years of getting reluctant teenagers to open up about their problems had given her an almost supernatural ability to make people feel heard. And Slade, for all his cruelty and cunning, was at his core a man who desperately wanted someone to recognize his genius. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching a chess master execute a trap that the opponent never saw coming. Then Slade stopped talking. His eyes narrowed and the wariness returned sharper this time. Why am I telling you this? He said. His voice had gone cold again. Because you are proud of what you have built, Dot said simply. And you should be. It is impressive. But her voice carried something new now. A slight edge that had not been there before. A shift in temperature so subtle that Slade almost missed it. Almost. However, Dot continued, her hands still folded in front of her, her posture still calm and collected. There is one thing you did not account for in your very impressive operation. One variable you overlooked. Slade took a step closer. His face had gone hard, the brief moment of openness slamming shut like a vault door. And what is that? Dot said. Before Slade could process the word, a sound cut through the night outside. The whoop of a police siren. Short and sharp. The signal. The next 30 seconds unfolded with the compressed, hyper-real quality of a car accident. Slade's head snapped toward the door. His hand went to his waistband, reaching for the weapon Dot knew was there. His two men moved simultaneously, one toward the back exit, the other toward Boomer. Then everything happened at once. The front door burst open and Sheriff Brannigan came through it first, his service weapon, Dronia's voice filling the room with the deep, commanding bark of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for 12 years. Sheriff's Department, hands where I can see them. Do not move. Deputies poured in behind him through both the front door and the service entrance at the back. The room filled with shouted commands and the click of weapons being drawn and the hard mechanical sounds of law enforcement doing what it was trained to do. Slade's hand froze halfway to his waistband. For one suspended heartbeat, Dot saw the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of odds, the consideration of violence. And she stepped forward directly into his line of sight and did something that no training manual would ever recommend and no rational person would ever attempt. She looked him in the eye and shook her head, slowly, once, the way a teacher looks at a student who is about to make the worst decision of their life. "Do not," she said quietly, and Slade's hand dropped. The deputies moved in. Hands were zip-tied, rights were read. Slade's two men were taken down without resistance, their bravado evaporating the moment the badges appeared. Boomer was cut free from the folding chair, his wrists raw and bleeding where the zip ties had bitten into his skin. He looked at Dot with an expression of dazed incomprehension, as if he were trying to fit her into a category that his mind simply did not contain. Gunner came through the back door 30 seconds after the deputies as planned. His eyes went immediately to Dot, scanning her for injury with the rapid assessment of a man trained to evaluate casualties. When he saw her standing untouched in the center of the room, her cardigan still buttoned, her hands still folded, he let out a breath that seemed to drain years from his face. Brannigan approached Dot as his deputies led Slade and his men toward the waiting vehicles. The sheriff was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered face and careful eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades reading people for a living. But when he looked at Dot, there was something in his expression that went beyond professional respect. Something older. Something that had roots in a third-grade classroom where a patient woman had taught a struggling boy that he was worth believing in. "Are you all right, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked. "I am fine, Roy," she said. And then, because she was Dorothy Caldwell, and because the moment called for it, she reached into her cardigan pocket and held up the recorder. "I believe you will find this useful." Brannigan took the device with a hand that was not entirely steady. He looked at it, then at her, and a smile broke across his face that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know him well. "You are something else, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. It was then that Slade, being led past them toward the deputy's cruiser, his hands cuffed behind his back, stopped and turned his head. His dark eyes found Dot in the harsh light of the station's single fluorescent tube. The arrogance was still there, but it was fractured now, shot through with cracks of disbelief. "Who are you?" he said. And for the first time, the question was not a threat. It was genuine bewilderment. The confusion of a man who had built his world on the principle that power belongs to those who are willing to use force and who had just been undone by a woman who used nothing but patience in a wool cardigan. Dot looked at him. She thought about all the students she had taught over 4 decades. The tough ones and the scared ones and the angry ones and the lost ones. She thought about how many of them had grown up to be good people, not because someone punished them into obedience, but because someone believed in them hard enough and long enough that they began to believe in themselves. And she thought about how Slade had probably been one of those lost children once, a long time ago, before someone failed to reach him and he found a different kind of power to fill the void. "I am a teacher," she said, "and the lesson for today is this. Do not ever underestimate a woman who has spent her life making stubborn people learn things they did not want to learn." Slade said nothing. He stared at her for another moment, then turned and let the deputies guide him into the back of the cruiser. The door closed, the engine started, and the taillights disappeared down Route 7, carrying with them the man who had terrorized this corner of Tennessee for the better part of a decade. In the silence that followed, Dot became aware of several things simultaneously. The crickets had resumed their singing. The stars were extraordinarily bright. Her knees were shaking so badly that she was not entirely sure they would continue supporting her weight. Gunner appeared at her side as if summoned by some unspoken signal. Without a word, he offered his arm, and Dot took it, leaning into his solid frame with a gratitude she did not need to express. "Let us go home," she said. The weeks after the arrest unfolded like a river, finding its new course after a dam is broken. The FBI field office in Knoxville took over the investigation within 48 hours, exactly as Brannigan had predicted. Federal agents arrived in Cedar Hollow in unmarked cars, interviewing business owners, subpoenaing bank records, and dismantling Slade's network with the methodical precision of people who had done this many times before. Marlene's analysis became the backbone of the case. Her spreadsheets, her cross-references, her meticulous documentation of the gap between Slade's reported revenue and the physical capacity of his businesses, all of it was exactly the kind of evidence that prosecutors build convictions on. The lead federal agent, a woman named Harris, with sharp eyes and an economy of speech that reminded Dot of herself, called it the most comprehensive civilian financial analysis she had ever seen. It was built by an accountant and a school teacher, Agent Harris told the Knoxville newspaper. We just connected the dots they had already drawn. Gunner testified before a federal grand jury. He sat in that wood-paneled room in his borrowed button-down shirt, the one Dot had ironed that morning, with the same care she brought to everything, and told the truth about everything he had seen and done during his 5 years with the organization. The drugs, the violence, the protection rackets, the names and the dates and the places. He held nothing back and asked for nothing in return except the chance to live the rest of his life differently. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman from the Nashville office, asked him at the end of his testimony why he had decided to cooperate. Gunner was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands at the tattoos that would never fully wash away, and then he looked up. Because someone believed I was more than the worst thing I had ever done, he said, and I did not want to prove her wrong. Boomer testified too. So did 3 other members who came forward after the arrest men who had been looking for a way out and finally saw the door swing open. One by one, they sat in the same chair Gunner had occupied and told their pieces of the story. Each testimony was another thread pulled from the fabric of Slade's empire, and with each thread, the whole structure unraveled a little more. Slade and 7 of his associates were indicted on 43 federal counts, including money laundering, racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy. The trial would not begin for months, but the legal machinery was in motion, and it moved with the slow, grinding certainty of a glacier that had chosen its path and would not be turned aside. The immediate aftermath in Cedar Hollow was complicated. Some people regarded Dot as a hero. Others thought she was reckless, a foolish old woman who had been lucky. A few whispered that she had put the whole town at risk by provoking dangerous men instead of leaving the matter to professionals. Dot did not concern herself with any of these opinions. She had stopped worrying about what other people thought of her sometime around 1987, when the school board had tried to remove a Steinbeck novel from her classroom, and she had refused so thoroughly that 3 board members resigned rather than continue the argument. She had more immediate things to attend to. The first thing she did was help Gunner contact the Veterans Administration. Not the bureaucratic maze that had failed him before, but a specific caseworker at the VA hospital in Johnson City, whom Brannigan knew personally. A woman who specialized in combat veterans with PTSD and who understood that the system's failures did not excuse the system from trying again. Gunner went to his first appointment on a Wednesday morning in June, driving Earl's old truck with the windows down in the Tennessee countryside unspooling around him in shades of green and gold. He came home that evening looking hollowed out and shaken the way people often look after the first session of therapy, as if someone had opened a sealed room inside them and all the dust had come rushing out at once. It was hard, he told Dot, sitting on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea. It is supposed to be hard, she said. The worthwhile things always are. The second thing she did was fix things with Marlene. Not that they were entirely broken. The crisis with Slade had welded them together in ways that 1,000 normal family dinners could not have achieved. But there were deeper fractures, older ones, that had nothing to do with bikers and everything to do with a daughter who felt her mother did not need her, and a mother who feared her daughter saw her as a burden. They talked about it one afternoon on the porch while Gunner was at his therapy appointment and the children played in the garden. Really talked without the defensive walls and the polite deflections that had characterized their conversations for years. I was afraid you were disappearing, Marlene said, her voice tight. After Dad died, you just retreated into this house and your garden and your routine. I called and you always said you were fine. Fine. Every single time. And I knew you were not fine, but I did not know how to reach you. Dot was quiet for a moment. She watched Lily chase a butterfly through the tomato plants, her blonde pigtails catching the sunlight. I was afraid too, Dot admitted. Afraid that if I told you how lonely I was, you would try to move me to Portland, put me in one of those assisted living places. I would rather be lonely in my own house than comfortable in someone else's institution. Mom, Marlene said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. I would never do that. I just wanted to help. I just did not know how. You could start by visiting more, Dot said, and bringing those grandbabies with you. This house needs the sound of children. They held each other on the porch for a long time while the afternoon light turned golden and the garden hummed with bees. The third thing, and perhaps the most important, was the Veterans Center. It was a modest brick building on Pine Street downtown, wedged between a barbershop and a hardware store. The sign outside read Cedar Hollow Veterans Outreach Center, and the paint was peeling and the door stuck when the humidity was high, which in Tennessee was most of the time. But inside it was warm and clean and filled with men and women who understood things about each other that they could never fully explain to anyone else. The director was a man named Mike Lattimore, a Gulf War veteran who ran the center on a shoestring budget and the kind of dogged optimism that only a person who has seen the worst of humanity and still believes in it can sustain. When Dot brought Gunnar to meet him on a Thursday morning, Mike took one look at the tattoos and the scars and the haunted eyes and said, "We have been waiting for someone like you." Gunnar started by sitting in the back of the weekly support group, listening without speaking. But by the third session, he was talking. Haltingly at first, then with gathering force like a river breaking through a log jam. He told them about Afghanistan, about Thompson and Rodriguez and Vasquez, about the IED he should have seen, about the guilt that had driven him into the arms of men who promised brotherhood but delivered only more violence. The other veterans listened the way veterans do, without interruption, without judgment, with the deep bone-level understanding of people who have carried the same weight. After one session, a young man approached Gunnar in the parking lot. He was maybe 23, thin as a rail with the jumpiness of someone who still flinched at loud noises. His name was Tyler, and he had done 2 tours in Syria. "What you said in there," Tyler said, his hands jammed in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the asphalt. "About trying to make the noise stop. About looking for anything that would make you feel less broken." He swallowed hard. "That is exactly where I am right now. I have been thinking about some bad choices, some really bad choices." Gunnar looked at this kid, this boy who was standing on the same cliff edge he had stood on 10 years ago, and felt something shift inside his chest. A door opening, a light turning on in a room he had thought would stay dark forever. "Let us take a walk," Gunnar said. And they did. Down Pine Street, past the barbershop and the hardware store, into the park at the end of the road, where the maples were just beginning to turn. And Gunnar told Tyler his story. All of it. The parts he was proud of, and the parts that made him sick to remember. He told it without editing and without excuses, because the truth was the only thing he had left that was worth giving. When he told Dot about it that evening, sitting in their usual spots on the porch, she smiled the particular smile she reserved for her best students. The ones who finally understood not just the lesson, but why the lesson mattered. The months settled into a rhythm, a good rhythm, the kind that builds on itself each day, adding a small brick to a structure that only becomes visible over time. Gunnar expanded his work at the Veterans Center, leading a weekly support group for those struggling with addiction and isolation. He started a Saturday workshop teaching basic carpentry and home repair skills he had learned in the Marines and refined in Dot's garage. The waiting list grew so long that Mike had to add a second session. The community that had once regarded Gunnar with suspicion began to see him differently. Mrs. Peterson next door asked him to fix her fence, and when he finished the job in half a day without asking for payment, she told everyone at her church group. Mr. Jenkins at the hardware store started setting aside lumber scraps and surplus nails for Gunnar's Saturday workshops. The Wilson family, whose roof had been leaking for 2 years, woke up one morning to find Gunnar on their rooftop at 7 in the mornings, already hammering. The children of Cedar Hollow adopted him with the indiscriminate enthusiasm that children bring to anyone who will pay them genuine attention. They followed him on his rounds through town, peppering him with questions about tools and tattoos, and whether he had ever ridden his motorcycle through a ring of fire. Gunnar answered each question with the patient seriousness that children deserve and rarely receive. Colton and Lily visited every other weekend now, and the farmhouse filled with sounds it had not held in years: laughter, running feet, the slam of the screen door that Gunnar had fixed but deliberately left a little loose because Dot said she liked the way it sounded. Colton trailed Gunnar everywhere, handing him tools and asking how things worked. Lily made him friendship bracelets out of yarn and insisted he wear all of them simultaneously, which he did without complaint, their bright colors circling his tattooed wrists like tiny declarations of belonging. Marlene came more often too, not to supervise or inspect, but to be present, to sit on the porch with her mother and drink coffee and talk about things that mattered. She had begun volunteering at the Veterans Center herself, helping with their bookkeeping, applying the same meticulous skill she had used to dismantle Slade's financial empire to the more modest task of keeping a nonprofit solvent. One warm September evening, Dot was in her kitchen preparing supper when she heard something unusual outside. Not unusual in a frightening way, unusual in a way she could not quite identify. A murmur of voices, the crunch of gravel under many feet, a sound like something being set up or arranged. She dried her hands on her dish towel and walked to the front window and stopped. Her front yard was full of people, not a crowd in the chaotic sense, but a gathering, a deliberate, organized, purposeful collection of the people who made up her world. Mrs. Peterson was there carrying a casserole dish and wearing her Sunday hat on a Tuesday. Mr. Jenkins stood near the porch steps with his wife holding a hand-lettered sign that read, "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." The Wilson family had brought their children who were already playing in the grass with Colton and Lily. Tyler, the young veteran from Gunner's support group, stood near the garden fence looking uncomfortable, in a clean shirt, but he was there. Mike Lattimore from the Veterans Center, the librarian who ran the children's reading program, the young woman from the bakery on Main Street whose shop had been one of Slade's targets before Dot's intervention had shut the operation down. And in the center of it all, standing on her front walkway with his hat in his hands, was Sheriff Roy Brannigan. Dot stepped out onto the porch. She looked at the faces gathered before her, and for one of the very few times in her long and eventful life, words failed her completely. Gunner appeared beside her, and she could see from his expression that he had known. That this had been planned quietly and carefully behind her back. The slight upward curve at the corner of his mouth confirmed it. Brannigan cleared his throat. He was not a man comfortable with public speaking. He preferred the language of action, of warrants and evidence and handcuffs. But he straightened his shoulders and looked at Dot the way he had looked at her when he was 8 years old. And she had put a book in his hands and told him he was going to read it even if it took them all year. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began. Then he stopped, swallowed, and started again. "Dorothy, 42 years ago I walked into your classroom barely able to write my own name. My father was gone. My mother worked 3 jobs. I wore shoes that did not fit and clothes that did not match, and I was angry at the whole world for the hand I had been dealt. The yard was silent. Even the children had stopped playing. You kept me after school 3 days a week for 2 years," Brannigan continued. "You taught me to read. You taught me that I was worth someone's time. And when I told you I wanted to be a police officer, you did not laugh. You said, then you had better learn to spell subpoena." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathering. Brannigan's voice steadied. "What you did this summer, finding Gunner, taking him in, standing up to men that most people in this county were too frightened to even speak about, that was not reckless. It was not foolish. It was exactly who you have always been. A woman who sees people, really sees them, not what they look like or where they come from or what mistakes they have made, but who they are underneath and who they could become." He put his hat back on and looked out at the gathered crowd. "Mrs. Caldwell taught me to read 42 years ago," he said. "This summer she taught this entire town what courage looks like. And I think it is about time we said thank you." The applause started with Mrs. Peterson, who set down her casserole dish to clap. It spread through the yard like a wave, building in volume and warmth until it filled the evening air with a sound that Dot thought might be the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. More beautiful than bird song, more beautiful than wind chimes, more beautiful than the creek in the woods where she picked mint and rosemary on quiet mornings. She stood on her porch surrounded by the people who made up her life and let the tears come. Not the silent, private tears she had cried so many nights alone in this house, but open, grateful, unashamed tears. The tears of a woman who had spent 5 years wondering if she still mattered and who had just received her answer. Gunner stood beside her, his massive frame slightly behind hers, exactly where it should be. He was not the center of this moment. She was. And he understood that the way he was beginning to understand so many things he had thought were lost to him forever. Later, after the casseroles had been eaten and the pie had been served, and Mrs. Peterson had told the same story about her grandson 4 times, and the children had caught fireflies in mason jars, and Brannigan had quietly slipped away because he was still not comfortable being thanked, the yard emptied slowly. Cars pulled away down the gravel drive, headlights sweeping across the garden like searchlights finding their way home. Marlene was the last to leave. She hugged Dot on the porch for a long time, and when she pulled back, her eyes were red. "I am proud of you, Mom," she said, "and I am sorry it took me so long to say it." After everyone had gone, Dot and Gunnar sat in their usual spots on the porch, two rocking chairs side by side creaking softly against the weathered wood. The sky above Cedar Hollow was clear and deep, scattered with more stars than anyone could count in a lifetime. The wind chimes Earl had hung 20 years ago tinkled their familiar melody, and from the garden the last tomatoes of the season hung heavy on their vines waiting for morning. Gunnar had a mug of chamomile tea in his hands. He had picked up the habit from Dot, just as he had picked up the habit of watching sunsets from the porch and reading before bed and saying grace before meals. Small things, ordinary things, the things that build a life without anyone noticing until the life is already built. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "when you found me in those woods, I thought that was the end of everything. Thought I had finally run out of road." He turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes clear and steady in the starlight. Turns out it was just the beginning. Dot rocked slowly, her weathered hands folded in her lap. The same hands that had untied the knots from his chains, that had cleaned his wounds, that had held his shoulder while he wept. Small hands, old hands, hands that had changed the course of a man's life simply by refusing to let go. "That is what family does," she said. She reached over and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred and tattooed knuckles. "We find each other in the dark, and we hold on." Gunnar squeezed her hand gently. The night air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-turned earth. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called out its three-note song, and another answered from the ridge beyond the creek. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the noise in Gunnar's head was quiet, not gone. He did not think it would ever be entirely gone, but quiet, manageable, held at bay by the steady, persistent grace of a woman who had looked at him when the rest of the world looked away. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence in Dot's house was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of peace. The deep, contented quiet of a home that has people in it who choose to be there, who stay not because they have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else they would rather be. The rocking chairs creaked in their gentle rhythm. The stars turned overhead. And in a small white farmhouse in the hills of Tennessee, an old woman and a lost soldier sat together on the porch, watching the darkness and knowing with a certainty that only comes from having been tested that the light would return in the morning. It always did.